Our story begins in a world where everyone pours their savings into temples, converting every cent into incense to burn from dawn until dusk. Even if they starve themselves to skin and bones, they ensure the smoke never stops, for this is a world of divine miracles. We see that as long as one offers enough incense, they can reach the gods, receive a blessing, and climb to the very top of society. However, the most popular gods are so overwhelmed with offerings that they often take the money and do absolutely nothing. To be honest, it's a bit of a scam. Marcus decided it was better to back the underdogs. While others pray to the god of longevity for a long life, he puts all his chips on the king of the underworld, hoping to simply have his name erased from the book of the dead. While others beg the god of wealth for a fortune, he seeks a partnership with the god of unofficial wealth. It's a bold strategy, but his immediate problem is actually finding some cash. Without money, he can't even afford a single stick of incense. Luckily, having been a priest in his past life, Marcus knows the divine hierarchy perfectly. Most people only know the famous faces of fortune, like the great Lord Zhao or the legendary General Guan. Little do they know, there are actually 5 distinct gods of wealth, and the other 3 are almost entirely forgotten. There is the Eastern Lord Bai and the Southern Lord Chai. And then there is the Central Lord Chai. Aside from Lord Bai, who is somewhat known, most people wouldn't recognize the others if they walked past them. It seems even among the elite gods, there are those left out in the cold. And so, Marcus decides to head to the Great Wealth Temple to try his luck, wasting no more time. He soon arrives at the main hall and finds a map of the divine seats, beginning his search. In a place as massive as Lord Zhao's temple, there are dozens of shrines scattered about. However, after observing for a moment, he begins to notice a rather peculiar problem. In this vast complex, aside from the primary deity, the lower-tier gods are nowhere to be found. He wonders if his grand plan to worship the Forgotten Ones is about to fail before it even begins. But then, something catches his eye. Tucked away in a corner of the map are the words, backyard, a small area crowded with a long list of minor deities. As his eyes scan the names, he suddenly stops, his pupils shrinking as he spots one name in particular. The name written there is Lord Chai, the god of unofficial wealth. The staff member gives Marcus a look of pure disdain before reluctantly pulling out 3 sticks of incense and asking coldly which deity he's visiting. When he hears it's Lord Chai, he's baffled. Why on earth would anyone ignore the great Lord Zhao for someone like this? He remarks that he hasn't seen a single pilgrim for such an obscure god in years. To be honest, he thinks it's a waste of time. He asks if Marcus is absolutely certain, and upon receiving a nod, the worker just chuckles and shakes his head in disbelief. With a quick gesture, the name of Lord Chai appears on the incense. Marcus takes them and heads toward the security passage. While waiting in line to enter, we see 2 of his old classmates, Lily and Simon, walking out from the exit. Lily spots him and asks which god he's planning to worship, but before Marcus can even open his mouth to answer, Simon leans in and catches a glimpse of the writing on the incense, immediately letting out a mocking shout of surprise. He yells out the name of Lord Chai, laughing and asking what kind of god that even is, claiming he's never heard of him. The name, Lord Chai, echoes through the hall, drawing quite a bit of unwanted attention to our protagonist. Simon continues his mockery, saying he understands wanting to pray for wealth, but this choice makes no sense at all. He asks why Marcus wouldn't just stick to the orthodox god. They join in, telling the young man that choosing such an obscure deity is surely a waste of perfectly good incense money. They insist that in this temple, Lord Zhao is the only one who actually listens, while the one Marcus chose is famously ineffective. One man even calls him a genius, in a tone that suggests the exact opposite. Marcus simply asks them if they've ever actually tried. He challenges them, asking how they can be so certain the god won't answer if they've never bothered to ask. Simon bursts into a loud, arrogant laugh at this. He explains that the reason the god is considered useless is because people tried in the past and got nothing, which is why everyone stopped. It's common sense, really. He asks Marcus if he really thinks he's the only smart person in the world while everyone else is a fool. Lily just watches in silence. This time, Lily actually agrees with Simon's point of view. She explains to Marcus that these popular deities have been tested by countless people over many years, which is why they are so revered. In contrast, the one he wants to worship is, to put it bluntly, one of the gods who simply didn't make the cut. She asks if he understands her point, but then sighs, noting that since he already spent millions on the incense, there's no use talking. Ignoring them, Marcus follows the signs to the backyard, but the moment he steps inside, he's completely stunned. Compared to the grand pavilions and majestic statues of the front courtyard, this backyard can only be described as a total ruin. Overgrown with weeds and filled with crumbling buildings, it's a mess. Honestly, he thinks the temple management is being quite unfair. Even if this god isn't popular, he's still a deity. They could have at least bothered with some basic repairs or maintenance. Just because they can't sell incense for him, they treat him like this. As the old saying goes, clothes make the man, and gold makes the god. With the backyard in such a state of decay, it's no wonder that pilgrims refuse to set foot back here. When the pilgrims stop coming, the god's power fades, and the shrine falls even further into ruin. It has become a vicious cycle. Marcus spends quite a while searching before finally finding the shrine of Lord Chai among the debris. The roof tiles of the small shrine are shattered, and the gold paint on the clay statue of Lord Chai is peeling away. The entire altar looks utterly desolate. Feeling a pang of pity, Marcus decides not to start his prayers just yet. He picks up a few intact tiles from the ground to fix the shrine's roof and begins pulling out the surrounding weeds. Once he finishes tidying up, he finally lights his 3 sticks of incense and holds them up in a traditional Taoist salute. Standing before the altar, he begins to recite the sacred incantation to invite the deity, focusing his mind on the ancient words. He chants the prayer of the jade furnace, calling upon the true spirit to descend from the celestial realms and hear his plea. As the final words of the command echo through the quiet yard, he waits with a sincere heart for any sign of a response. Time ticks by second, but the statue remains motionless. At this point, Marcus begins to feel a wave of nervous tension. He tries his best to remain calm, deciding to simply kneel before the statue while holding the incense high with both hands. Little does he know, as the smoke curls upward, a wisp of essence rises from that incense and begins to drift away. It travels through the 9 heavens, arriving at a golden palace where the god of wealth sits upon his throne. Seated on his meditation mat, Lord Jacob suddenly opens his eyes in surprise, wondering how a mortal could be praying to him. It has been quite some time, after all, since anyone offered him such a sincere invitation. Just then, the temple doors swing open as an attendant rushes in, shouting with pure joy, "My lord, a wisp of prayer incense has actually flown into our temple." Jacob replies that he has already received it, amazed that after so long, there is still someone in the mortal realm who remembers him. He notes that this person even knows the secret arts of divine communication, suggesting their background is far from simple. With a curious smile, he decides it is time to descend to the lower realm and see for himself. Meanwhile, back in the temple backyard, Marcus has been kneeling for so long that his fingers begin to feel a searing heat. He snaps his head up to find the incense has nearly burned out, realizing that perhaps one attempt simply wasn't enough. He tells himself he needs more trials to make a clear judgment, refusing to feel discouraged by this initial silence. Success on the first try was a luxury he didn't expect, so he prepares to leave, offering a final respectful bow to Lord Jacob. He whispers that he will return to disturb the deity another time, but as he turns to walk away, a voice commands him to stop. An ethereal, holy voice echoes behind him, and his feet freeze in place as his pupils shrink with sudden shock. He whips around to see the clay statue inside the small shrine beginning to glow with a faint, shimmering gold light. Marcus immediately offers his greetings to the great deity, but the figure simply waves off the formalities. The deity tells him to rise, admitting that he hasn't tasted the incense of the mortal world for many long years. He looks at Marcus with interest, surprised that a young man in this day and age would still remember his name. The deity speaks plainly, noting that since Marcus has come to worship him, he must be seeking wealth and fortune. He asks why Marcus didn't choose to pray to the more popular god of wealth, rather than seeking out his humble shrine. After all, most mortals claim the other gods are far superior to him, a slight exaggeration, perhaps, but a common one. Marcus replies respectfully that the world is simply blind, failing to recognize Lord Jacob's true and ancient significance. He acknowledges Jacob as the emperor of wealth and the true head of the 5 paths, the one who truly governs all fortune. The deity is genuinely taken aback, surprised that anyone in the mortal realm still remembers his original title. We see a flicker of pride in the god's eyes as Marcus begins to recount the history of the Emperor of Wealth. He speaks of the legendary ruler from the old dynasties, a man who was a merchant in his youth before ascending the throne. As emperor, he loved his people like his own children, implementing trade policies that brought prosperity to every household. Known as the Great King, he was eventually deified as a god of wealth, and Marcus asks if his humble knowledge is correct. The deity is impressed, noting that for such a young man, Marcus's understanding of history is remarkably detailed and accurate. Moved by such sincerity, Lord Jacob decides he cannot refuse, offering Marcus a unique opportunity for the next 2 days. He promises that fortune will flow toward him effortlessly, advising him to return later to fulfill his vows once he succeeds. Marcus offers his deepest thanks as the golden light surrounding the clay statue begins to slowly fade away. Once the light vanishes completely, he feels a sudden shift in the air and looks up to see a strange sight. A gentle, shimmering rain of gold begins to fall, soaking him completely. The divine gift the deity promised has arrived. It feels incredible, and he realizes that by combining this blessing with his past knowledge, he is truly unstoppable. The world suddenly feels full of endless possibilities, and he finally feels certain that his old theories will work here. After returning home, he begins to meticulously plan his next move, knowing he must act while the iron is hot. Since Lord Jacob said this luck would last for 2 days, he tells himself that tomorrow is the day he must strike it rich. Marcus knows he must work hard, as his current situation demands he earn his first fortune to pave the way for his future. He needs a solid foundation to become stronger. After all, if he can't even afford incense money, how could he progress? However, 2 days of luck is far too short, so he tells himself he must find a way to stay in favor. He needs to build a deeper connection with Lord Jacob to increase his divine favor, and he considers the first method. The fastest way to gain a god's favor is undoubtedly through constant, lavish offerings during worship. But for Marcus, who is currently penniless, this is clearly not a practical option. To be honest, it's impossible. The second method involves helping the deity gain popularity and fame to attract more followers and offerings. But since obscure gods are already seen as ineffective by the public, changing that deep-rooted impression is a massive hurdle. So that won't work either. The third method is completing specific tasks for the deity to significantly boost divine favor. This is the simplest and most effective way, yet it comes with a catch. One needs a baseline of favor first. You would likely need 20 or even 30% favor just to be eligible for a divine task, which is no easy feat. Then there is the fourth method, inviting the god to a private shrine. A bold move, certainly. This involves moving the deity from the public temple to one's own home for personal worship. But in this world, inviting a god costs millions, a price tag that is currently far beyond his reach, which, naturally, rules that out. After much thought, a sudden spark of inspiration hits him. The essence of incense and worship is collective willpower. If he wants the deity to gain merit quickly, there is one method that stands above all others. In the world of Taoist rituals, the grand ceremony of heaven is considered the absolute pinnacle of merit-making. It is a grand feast of merit for the gods, where a single ceremony can satisfy the entire heavenly host. It ensures prosperity and peace for the mortal realm, though a top-tier ritual like that is currently out of his league. While he can't perform the grandest rites yet, he feels more than capable of handling a few smaller, effective rituals. He made up his mind. When the time came to fulfill his vow, he would test his skills as a ritual master with Lord Jacob. He hoped to find a lever to shift his divine favor. The next morning, after a quick breakfast, he headed to his old classmate Danny's lottery shop. Since he was currently blessed with luck, specifically the kind for windfall wealth, he naturally sought the fastest way to strike it rich. And what better way to test that luck than a few scratch-off tickets? Just as he was celebrating a sudden win of 260,000, his entire body gave a violent, sudden shudder. In that instant, he felt completely drained. His luck had run dry. To be sure, he quickly grabbed one more ticket to check. Unsurprisingly, he didn't win a single cent this time. Still, turning $100 into over $250,000 is nothing to complain about. With the money secured, Marcus was feeling quite pleased with himself. He pulled $500 in cash from his pocket and slapped it on the table. He offered it to Danny as a tip to share the good fortune, but his friend waved it off, refusing to take his money. The two old classmates began to chat across the counter. Danny leaned in, mentioning that the divine favor trials were coming up next week. He shared some inside information. Starting with their year, the student system was changing. The passing grade for the upcoming trial was being set at 2%. Anyone with divine favor lower than that would be asked to leave the school immediately. The reason for the change was simple: external pressure. Several new, dangerous secret realms had appeared across the country recently. The number of malevolent spirits was rising, and the government was feeling the strain. The restructuring was meant to increase competitiveness. Essentially, they wanted to handpick the best talents for further training, while sending the ordinary students out into society to find their own way. That was a major shift. Marcus wondered if those who managed to stay behind would receive any special support or benefits. Danny wasn't entirely sure of the details, but based on the current analysis, the school would certainly ramp up the intensity. He suspected they might be sent to the mission hall early. After all, the authorities wouldn't let them stay comfortable in school forever. The best way to toughen them up was to make them adapt to the pace of society by handling real-world tasks ahead of schedule. It made sense. If that truly was the case, then Danny's sources were likely right on the money. This would be a new stage where opportunities and risks existed side by side. After chatting for a few more minutes, Marcus realized it was getting late and prepared to head home. On the way, he kept mulling over Danny's words. If the academy really was restructuring starting with their senior class, having the right to accept missions early would be an absolute godsend for him. Originally, his plan was to spend these few years quietly making money, defeating a few obscure deities to slowly build his strength, and then taking on paid missions after graduation. He had planned to earn rewards and military merit to reach the top of the world step by step, but now that wait was going to be significantly shortened. It meant he could save years of grinding. Plus, with over 200,000 in his pocket, he wasn't short on incense money. It was time to consider boosting his actual combat power. Since his current deities were both support types, he needed to find a combat-oriented one to worship. He decided to visit the temple again, but first, he needed to prepare some offerings, specifically ritual items. He wanted to see if his skills as a ritual master actually worked on these deities, and finally fulfill his vow to Lord Jacob. No sooner said than done. He spent the entire afternoon preparing the ritual items, and once everything was ready, he shouldered his backpack and returned to the Zhao family temple. The place was still crowded with worshippers. He headed straight to the incense counter to request a stick of black incense for Lord Jacob. To buy it, one needed a divine favor of over 5%, which he luckily just barely met. But shortly after he left, the staff member at the counter suddenly made a phone call, his eyes fixed on Marcus's retreating back. "Boss, that kid from yesterday is back. It looks like he's here to fulfill a vow." "Back so soon? That boy certainly is. Well, he's certainly ambitious, isn't he?" "Understood." Meanwhile, Marcus lit the black incense and once again used the incense spirit incantation. He respectfully invited Lord Jacob. In the heavenly palace, sitting upon his prayer mat, Lord Jacob suddenly felt a jolt. A particularly rich wave of incense surged into his body, instantly refreshing his spirit. It seemed that young man was back again. He suspected the boy must have come into quite a fortune. To be honest, he wasn't wrong. Then, that ethereal voice echoed once more. Marcus greeted him respectfully, calling out to Lord Jacob. The deity chuckled, noting that the boy was certainly being proactive today. In just half a day, the wealth he had bestowed upon Marcus had already been spent, which, naturally, was quite a feat in itself. He asked Marcus how it felt to experience such an unexpected windfall. Marcus didn't miss a beat with his reply. He praised the deity's immense power, claiming that even a slight gesture from him was the absolute limit of what a blessing could achieve. It was a bit of a stretch, perhaps, but Marcus was laying the flattery on thick to show his appreciation. He told the deity that his admiration was like a surging river, endless and overflowing. A bit dramatic, wouldn't you say? Lord Jacob noted that while the boy was respectful yesterday, he had certainly learned how to be a smooth talker today. However, the deity offered a stern warning. Easy money comes just as easily as it goes. It was a classic lesson in humility. He had granted a blessing because of Marcus's sincerity, but warned him not to get lost in the pursuit of quick riches. He didn't want the boy to become obsessed and unable to extricate himself from greed. Marcus took the advice to heart. He promised to remember the teachings and vowed to walk the right path from now on. He told himself he wouldn't be swayed. He swore that his mind would never be clouded by the lure of easy money. Lord Jacob found this response quite satisfactory. After accepting the incense, the deity prepared to return to the heavenly palace. But before leaving, he paused for a moment. He decided to leave Marcus with one final instruction. If the boy was sincere, he should return to this temple every 3 days. By offering a single stick of incense with a sincere heart, fortune would naturally follow. It was a subtle hint, to say the least. Hearing this, Marcus could hardly contain his amusement. The meaning behind Lord Jacob's words was as clear as day. As long as he kept coming back to offer incense, the deity would eventually take the initiative to look after him and grant more blessings. But since he was a god, he couldn't exactly ask for it directly, and so he simply said that sincerity brings fortune. Marcus bowed deeply, promising to remember Lord Jacob's kindness, but then asked the deity to wait as he had one more thing to offer. He reached into his backpack for something he had prepared earlier, something that could only be truly appreciated through this specific vessel. He explained that he had brought some valuables and hoped the deity wouldn't find them too humble. Lord Jacob, however, was skeptical. The deity reminded him that he only accepted incense, and that the material goods of the mortal world were of no use to him. He told Marcus to take them back, but the boy urged him not to be in such a hurry. He had a plan, you see. Marcus claimed these weren't ordinary valuables and asked for a chance to prove it. If it worked, it would be a true token of his gratitude. He placed a yellow paper bundle on the ground and flicked his lighter. To an outsider, it looked like he was just burning trash. In Taoist traditions, this bundle is known as golden clouds, containing ritual paper money and gold foil, a bit more sophisticated than it looks. This wasn't just any paper money either. It was 9-fold gold, specifically crafted for the gods. But that wasn't all he had prepared. He had also included dragon and phoenix garments, not currency, but items. He had drawn several sets of fine robes on the paper for Lord Jacob. To top it all off, he had transcribed a merit scripture as the grand finale of his gift. He was certainly going all out today. On the other side, Lord Jacob watched this display with utter confusion. He wondered why the boy had suddenly started a bonfire in the middle of their chat. Since ancient times, mortals had offered incense or physical sacrifices. Burning paper, however, seemed like a strange new development to him. Times had changed, and offerings had evolved from simple fruits and cakes into various spiritual items imbued with great merit and power. But such spiritual items were incredibly rare. They certainly didn't usually find their way to the hands of minor local deities. Ordinary gods who earned their status through merit were often overlooked, as the high-ranking celestial spirits claimed the best offerings for themselves. Lord Jacob couldn't help but wonder when burning paper had become a form of worship. Even for a god, this was a bit of a learning curve. As the fire in the golden clouds grew more intense and the ashes began to swirl upward, something unexpected started to happen. The dim, gray space around the statue was suddenly illuminated by 10,000 rays of golden light. It was quite a spectacular sight, really. Lord Jacob's expression shifted to one of pure shock as he looked around. At first, he thought it was incense, but he quickly realized he was wrong. Those 10,000 rays of golden light rapidly gathered, first transforming into a stack of paper currency that began circling before his eyes. Lord Jacob stared at the stack of glowing golden bills, his divine eyes narrowing in shock as he processed what he was seeing. He realized this wasn't ordinary money, it was celestial gold. He wondered how a mere boy could possibly possess such a thing. It seemed impossible. In fact, it was absolutely impossible, or so he told himself. Celestial gold only circulates in the heavenly court, so how could a common mortal own an item belonging to the gods? Lord Jacob refused to believe it at first, but after confirming it repeatedly, he was certain it was indeed celestial gold. A wave of pure shock washed over him. As a minor deity under the heavenly treasury, his monthly salary was quite modest. The amount Marcus was burning right now equaled a year and a half of his pay. He began to wonder who the real god of wealth was here. Before Lord Jacob could even calm his racing heart, the golden light gathered once more to form something new. This time, it wasn't currency, but several sets of exquisitely crafted silk robes that looked incredibly valuable. He wondered about the boy's true background. Even as a god, this kind of secret ritual was something he had never encountered. He had never heard of or seen such a thing. Where could a mortal have learned this? But the surprises weren't over yet. Suddenly, the entire space around the statue erupted in brilliant light, which transformed into countless golden lotus flowers. These lotuses began flowing into Lord Jacob's body. This was pure merit. That small yellow bundle was far more than it seemed. It was truly miraculous. He couldn't believe that a mortal could actually offer merit directly in such a way. Furthermore, the merit contained in that single yellow bundle was equivalent to the incense offerings of 10,000 people. Lord Jacob was thrown into a complete panic. For a deity like him who achieved godhood through merit, this was his very lifeblood. Without merit, a god like him would eventually lose their divine powers, and even their very existence would fade away. Only the primordial spirits are truly immortal. Lesser gods like him rely entirely on the grace of offerings to survive. Though he didn't know what method the boy used to manifest this merit, he knew his entire divine life was about to change. The merit was undeniable, and its presence was as real as the ground beneath them. In an instant, Lord Jacob's expression shifted into a complex mask of shock and suspicion. "Boy," he demanded, "who exactly were your ancestors? How do you possess such miraculous secret arts? Tell me the truth." Marcus felt his pupil's contract. His plan was working. "Great Lord," Marcus replied, "I truly have no idea what my family's background is, but I believe they must have been quite capable. Otherwise, I suspect my family would have vanished into the long river of history ages ago, never surviving until today. As for these methods, to be honest, I learned them all from a secret ancestral manual. I had only read a few pages when the scroll suddenly burst into flames, and the knowledge was instantly seared into my mind. I can only assume this was a deliberate design by my ancestors to protect their secrets," he added convincingly. To prevent Lord Jacob from asking for a manual that didn't actually exist, Marcus cleverly claimed it had been destroyed. It was a necessary lie, really, just to avoid the god asking to take a look at the goods himself. "I won't hide it, Lord. I made this offering partly to seek your favor and partly to see if these secret arts actually worked. But mostly, I wish to repay your kindness. Without your blessing, I would still be starving today." As he spoke, he even managed to squeeze out a few tears, painting a perfect picture of a grateful, humble soul. Inside the statue, Lord Jacob watched Marcus's emotional display, and his lips twitched with a hint of a smile. He told himself that perhaps meeting this boy was simply his own destiny, and he decided to let the matter rest. "It seems you are a man of great fortune," the god said. "Your ancestors were clearly extraordinary to have fallen so far. They must have suffered a great catastrophe. My young friend, you have done well." We notice the title has changed from boy to young friend. It seems Marcus's social standing with the divine is skyrocketing. "Yes, Lord Jacob, you are most wise," Marcus replied, keeping the momentum of the conversation going perfectly. "Since you are so filial," the god concluded, "I shall not refuse your generous offerings any longer. Please, great Lord, take it all. If this helps you in any way, I could ask for nothing more." "By the way," Marcus added, "I recall another method recorded in those secret ancestral arts. If performed correctly, it could be worth 100,000 incense offerings." Lord Jacob was stunned. He wondered if the boy truly possessed such heaven-defying secrets. Inside his divine space, his expression shifted violently. He was about to ask if it was true, but he forced himself to swallow the words. He told himself to stay calm. He was a god, after all, and shouldn't be so easily swayed by a mortal. But then he thought, this was 100,000 offerings. To be honest, even the strongest resolve would crumble under that kind of pressure. "Young friend," the god began, "we can discuss the matter of merit a bit later." Suddenly, a new idea has blossomed in my mind. I wonder if you would do me the honor. Marcus bowed. "You honor me too much, Lord. Please, speak your mind. I feel as though we are old friends meeting again. It brings me great joy. Why don't the two of us become sworn brothers? What do you think of that, young friend?" "I would be honored." The words left Marcus's mouth before he even realized what was happening. Then he froze. He stared at the statue in utter disbelief. Wait, did a god just ask to be his sworn brother? As the divine resonance settled, Marcus immediately knelt on the ground. "Big brother, please accept my humble bow." Good, good. Lord Jacob's voice boomed with genuine delight. "Today is truly a magnificent day. Now that we are sworn brothers, I cannot let the occasion pass empty-handed. I don't have much on me, but please accept this fortune ingot. Consider it a gift for my new younger brother. With this treasure, no matter what business you undertake, your chances of success will increase by 30%. A flash of golden light erupted, and an ingot-shaped pendant appeared before him, radiating a brilliant glow. Marcus was overjoyed. He didn't hesitate to accept the treasure and put it on, unaware it held yet another special power. There was even a chance to trigger a guaranteed success. If he heard the sound of a falling coin, it meant the effect had been activated. Marcus was stunned by the sheer value of it. He told his new brother it was far too precious, but Lord Jacob wouldn't hear of it. Besides this fortune ingot, the god decided to bestow upon him a divine ability as well. This power was known as the treasure-seeking eye. With it, every object in the mortal world would reveal its true value to Marcus. Just as the words faded, another golden light erupted from the statue and shot directly into his eyes. He blinked, and when he looked again, the world before him had transformed into a sea of numbers. With another blink, they vanished, showing he had already mastered the gift. Having received 2 treasures, Marcus bowed in gratitude. He thanked his elder brother profusely, but the god simply waved it off with a smile. To be honest, Lord Jacob admitted his current powers were a mere shadow of what they once were. Otherwise, he would have given Marcus even greater treasures. He felt quite limited by his current state. Marcus understood perfectly how vital incense and merit were to a god. He immediately showed his loyalty. He promised to do everything in his power to provide more merit. However, he added a small warning. He explained that while his family's secret arts were miraculous, the requirements were incredibly harsh. They required secret incantations, and the stronger the spell, the higher the demand on one's strength. If his own power wasn't enough, he would have to offer his spiritual energy as a sacrifice. In reality, all this talk of spiritual energy was just a clever bit of storytelling on Marcus's part. It only cost him a bit of effort and some raw materials. He had two reasons for this deception. First, he knew that if things came too easily, people, and even gods, would stop valuing them. Even though the two had become sworn brothers, Marcus understood the god of wealth's true motives perfectly well. Deep down, he knew Lord Jacob only valued him for his unique ability to provide massive amounts of merit. If he were to grant the gods every wish without limit, this precious incense and merit would quickly lose its value, making it much harder for Marcus to gain more benefits in the future. Lord Jacob urged his younger brother not to be impatient, telling him there was no need to rush. The god spoke calmly, though we can imagine he felt a flicker of disappointment at the delay. Still, he realized that if such a heaven-defying secret art could be performed easily, it would be unnatural. Restrictions actually made sense. He then asked what level of strength was required to perform this secret technique. Marcus replied that he wasn't entirely sure yet, but he had a rough estimate in mind. He predicted that he would likely need to reach the level of a rank 3 spiritualist at the very least. In this mystical world, spiritualists are divided into 9 ranks, with rank 1 being the starting point. Rank 3 represents a formidable level of power, and growth depends entirely on one's connection to the gods. This connection is called divinity sync. The higher it is, the more blessings and rewards a mortal receives. Furthermore, when a spiritualist enshrines a god, a portion of divine power is naturally left behind for them. This residual power transforms into the practitioner's own mana, allowing them to grow stronger over time. Even if a god doesn't grant specific treasures, simply serving them long enough will increase a spiritualist's strength. However, reaching rank 3 was no small feat, and Lord Jacob looked a bit troubled by the requirement. As a god of wealth, his ability to directly boost Marcus's combat strength was naturally quite limited. Moreover, since this was someone else's temple, he couldn't leave much divine power within Marcus's body. So, he suggested that Marcus should look into finding a way to officially invite his statue elsewhere. Lord Jacob then asked what it would cost to bring him home, noting that if Marcus officially enshrined him, he could leave behind at least 20% more divine power each time. This meant that for every 5 offerings, it would be like getting an extra session compared to the temple. It wasn't a massive difference, but better than nothing. He promised that once he was invited to Marcus's home, whenever his younger brother called upon him, he would surely come. He then asked Marcus what he thought of the proposal. To be honest, it was a tempting offer. Marcus's eyes lit up at the idea of bringing the god of wealth home. It meant he would finally have a permanent patron. From that moment on, why would he ever have to worry about money again? He felt a surge of genuine excitement. He immediately agreed, telling his big brother that he had been thinking the exact same thing. He couldn't bear to see the god stuck in such a dilapidated place. While he couldn't build a proper temple yet, he promised that once he was stronger, he would build a magnificent golden palace to honor the god of wealth's great name. Lord Jacob was visibly moved by the promise of his own grand temple and asked his younger brother if he truly meant those words. Marcus replied with absolute, unwavering certainty that he did. The god was overjoyed, realizing he hadn't misjudged Marcus. After years of declining worship, he had nearly given up hope. He felt that fate had finally smiled upon him by letting him meet someone as loyal and righteous as Marcus. Words couldn't express his gratitude. Marcus had restored his confidence, and he vowed to ensure Marcus's eternal prosperity. Hearing this, Marcus was equally moved, his voice trembling slightly as he told his brother not to worry. He promised he would never forget their bond, and the two shared a moment of deep, mutual respect. They exchanged titles of brother back and forth with such intensity that if anyone else had been present, they would surely have given these two dramatic actors a standing ovation. After the sentimental moment passed, Lord Jacob gradually calmed his emotions and suggested they proceed with the plan, though he added a final warning. He explained that if Marcus wanted to reach the 3rd rank of spiritualist quickly, the best way was to enshrine a deity with 5 divine forms. He suggested Marcus make a choice and then inform the temple staff, promising to put in a good word to help his younger brother along. Since it was getting late, they decided to end the session there, with Lord Jacob waiting for Marcus's news as he returned to his statue. As the golden light vanished, Marcus let out a long breath, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer scale of his success today. Not only had he tested the offerings, but he had also befriended the god of wealth and gained both treasures and divine abilities. From now on, he truly had friends in high places, and he couldn't help but imagine how wonderful it would be to have a full temple at home. As he left, he happened to pass the hall of the Thunder Lord and came to a sudden, sharp halt. The Thunder Lord was the supreme deity of the lightning department. Gaining his approval would make clearing monster dungeons a walk in the park. Never one to hesitate, Marcus turned back toward the incense counter to request 20 sticks specifically for the Thunder Lord. However, the staff member behind the counter stared at him with wide eyes, visibly shaken by the golden light still radiating from Marcus's body. With a pale face, the clerk stammered, asking if he had succeeded again, to which Marcus modestly replied it was just a bit of luck. The clerk remarked that such luck was far too consistent, noting that Marcus was glowing so brightly it was almost blinding. He joked that Marcus wouldn't even need to turn on the lights at night, wondering just how massive a blessing he had received. The staff member, now completely incoherent with shock, urgently suggested that Marcus go and test his divine synchronization level immediately. Marcus agreed to the test, but asked for his incense first, taking the sticks and heading toward the testing window. Meanwhile, a man in a sharp suit pushed through the crowd, making his way toward the same testing area. Sensing something, Marcus glanced back and saw the man watching him intently with crossed arms, his badge identifying him as the manager. A faint sense of unease washed over him. He wondered if the temple was worried he might actually damage their reputation. It was common knowledge that this temple was famous for its primary god of wealth, yet Marcus had just received an unprecedented blessing. If word got out about the sheer scale of the favor he had gained from Lord Jacob, it might cause quite a stir for the temple's hierarchy. If another deity's influence grew too strong, it would inevitably diminish the offerings meant for Lord Jacob, the temple's main patron. This was certainly not a scenario the temple wanted to see, which explained the manager's cold and unwelcoming expression. As the testing machine hummed to life, a tense silence filled the room until a cold line of text appeared on the screen. It showed a synchronization level of 43% with the god of wealth, a result that caused the entire crowd to erupt in excitement. The manager, Marcus Sr., who had been silent until now, finally leaned in and sent a private message directly to our protagonist. He told Marcus that while he was welcome to worship other deities at their temple, the god of wealth was strictly off limits. Marcus couldn't understand the logic. Even if different forms of the deity were in competition, they were all part of the same temple. He pointed out that if any deity's incense flourished, the temple itself would surely benefit rather than suffer a loss. The manager admitted the logic was sound, but noted that Marcus had overlooked the most important detail, the family name on the door. Marcus realized then that there was no room for negotiation, yet he wasn't quite ready to give up without a fight. He asked what would happen if he insisted on coming back, curious to see just how far the manager would go. The manager scoffed, asking if Marcus really thought he could offer worship if the temple staff decided to make it impossible. Marcus reminded him that the law was clear. Unless a practitioner had a criminal record, a temple could not legally block their offerings. He asked if they were really prepared to break the law, but the manager, Marcus Sr., had stopped hiding his true colors. He told Marcus not to lecture him, explaining that just as they could introduce new deities, they also had the power to remove others. They could easily withdraw any deity whose incense offerings failed to meet their standards, including the one Marcus favored. He asked Marcus how he planned to worship if the deity's statue was simply gone from the premises. In the entire province, this temple was the only one that housed such a niche and unpopular deity. If they removed the statue, Marcus would find himself with absolutely nowhere else to turn for his specific spiritual needs. The manager's blatant focus on performance metrics left Marcus fuming, stunned by the sheer shamelessness of the temple's leadership. Marcus knew that while the manager, Jacob, had his schemes, he had a few tricks of his own, especially if they threatened to remove the deity. If they wanted to play that way, fine, but the government had strict regulations on the price of inviting a deity's statue. For a niche figure like the god of talent with almost zero offerings, the legal price was usually between $600,000 and $800,000. The temple could legally raise that by 20%, making it $960,000, a sum Marcus was prepared to pay. He pointed out that if he paid, they were legally bound to agree, though Jacob simply laughed at the idea. Jacob asked where he'd find nearly $1 million, noting that yesterday's blessing likely only earned him a fraction of that amount. With the payment deadline only a week away, he'd need to find $100,000 a day, a nearly impossible task. Besides, Jacob knew that the god of talent was merely a minor branch of the god of wealth. He told Marcus to be grateful for one stroke of luck, as a second miracle was strictly out of the question. Jacob spoke with the confidence of a man who held all the cards, having seen right through Marcus's current financial situation. Marcus couldn't help but realize that compared to low-level thugs like Simon, this manager was in a completely different league. But there was no time for idle talk. At this point, he truly had no other choice but to stand his ground. The Jacob family was clearly determined to sever his connection with the god of talent once and for all. Just as the tension between the two men reached its breaking point, a sudden commotion erupted outside the temple walls. We see 2 rows of men in black suits marching in, roughly pushing the ordinary worshippers aside to clear the path. They cleared a wide, open space before an elegant and incredibly wealthy-looking procession made its grand entrance. Leading the group was a middle-aged man with a steady, composed aura, looking like someone who had seen it all. Despite his relatively young face, his hair was already turning white, and beside him walked a woman of striking beauty. Her cold, elegant presence immediately drew the gaze of everyone in the room, including Marcus himself. The manager's face lit up instantly as he rushed forward, exclaiming that Mr. Sterling had finally arrived. Dropping his previous arrogant posture, Jacob put on a smile we've never seen before and rushed to greet the newcomer. This was Mr. Sterling, the head of the Sterling family from the south, one of the 4 great clans ruling the city. Between the north, south, west, and east, these 4 families controlled the cities for major temples as their own private industries. Marcus realized why the woman looked so familiar. She was a Sterling, likely the famous socialite, Elena Sterling. She asked if everything had been arranged, to which Jacob replied with a bow that everything was perfectly in order. He explained that as soon as he received the family's orders, he had immediately begun the preparations. The Hall of Longevity had been cleared of commoners, waiting specifically for their grand arrival. "You've done well, Jacob," the man noted. Mr. Sterling promised a heavy reward once the matter was settled, before turning to call upon a man named Master Silas. Everyone turned to see a middle-aged man with a goatee and a look of supreme arrogance slowly walking through the crowd. The whispers started immediately. People recognized him as Silas Thorne, a man with a reputation that preceded him. Known by the nickname, the Immortal of Longevity, Master Silas made his way directly toward Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling told him that everything now rested in his hands, and Silas nodded with practiced, calm confidence. He assured the family head that he would exhaust every effort to pray for the old patriarch's longevity and heavenly blessing. Led by Jacob himself, the group headed straight for the Hall of Longevity, leaving the rest of the temple in a stunned silence. Only after they were gone did the surrounding whispers grow loud enough for us to hear the truth behind the visit. It seemed the rumors were true. The Sterling patriarch had suddenly collapsed, and word was his life force was fading fast. The family was now desperately searching for any spiritualist capable of extending a life, hoping to buy the old man more time. The reward they were offering was described as astronomical, a sum that could change a man's life forever. Marcus's ears perked up as he caught those key words. He knew Silas was only a second-rank spiritualist, despite his fame. But Silas's synchronization with the god of longevity was rumored to be 47%, the highest in the entire province. He's likely in the top 3 in the entire province. With talent like that, the Sterling patriarch might actually have a chance. As the crowd rushed to catch the excitement, Marcus followed them toward the Hall of Longevity. This was his first real chance to see a professional spiritualist handle a high-stakes mission for a top-tier client like the Sterling family. When he finally arrived, the Hall of Longevity was already packed tight. A wall of staff and Sterling security guards had been deployed, forming a human barrier and a cordon to keep the curious onlookers several meters away. Inside the main hall, however, the statue of the god of longevity stood majestic and kind. Only the Sterlings, Silas, and a few others remained inside. Jacob and his men stood by as Silas Thorne, the so-called immortal, lit the expensive purple incense and began the ritual. Outside, people were already placing bets on how many tries it would take. "If he's lucky, maybe just once," one man whispered. "But if his luck is out, 10 attempts wouldn't be unusual. If you really want to bet, I'm putting my money on 10. Listening to the chatter, Marcus noted that Silas was only a second-rank spiritualist, weaker, in fact, than a common bodyguard. And yet, he enjoyed a level of prestige that even a 5th or 6th-rank spiritualist might never see in their lifetime. That is the power of a popular deity. Having a 47% synchronization rate gave Silas every reason to be arrogant. Marcus felt a spark of curiosity and turned to the two men making bets. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he asked politely. "How much does Master Silas usually charge for a service like this?" They admitted they didn't know the exact figures, but rumor had it he once charged 7 million to grant someone a single year of life. Marcus then asked about the limit. Apparently, the maximum is 1 year per ritual, and Silas has a rule: no person can ask for more than 2 extensions. After all, life is a gift from the heavens. Asking for more would be pushing one's luck. Hearing this, Marcus narrowed his eyes. He realized that if he could find a way to worship a deity capable of extending life, he might just be able to take a significant piece of the market away from Silas. Inside the hall, Silas suddenly opened his eyes, looking quite puzzled. It seemed his first attempt at the offering had failed, which, to be honest, wasn't entirely unexpected. "How strange," Silas muttered. In the past, every time he communicated with the god of longevity, the old deity would always offer at least some small response. But today, there wasn't even a ripple of spiritual energy, leaving Silas with a growing sense of unease. He took a deep breath, lifting the incense once more before him. However, the second attempt was, unsurprisingly, another failure. Beads of sweat began to form on Silas's forehead as his heart rate quickened. Refusing to rest, he immediately lit the incense again. Yet the third time was a failure. The fourth, a failure. The fifth, a failure. How could this be happening? He wondered if the god of longevity simply didn't want him to bestow a blessing upon the Sterling family. His heart nearly sank into his stomach, and the Sterlings felt their own hopes plummeting right along with his. 1 or 2 failures might be expected, but after a dozen failed attempts, Jacob Sterling's anxiety was magnified 1,000-fold. Refusing to believe his luck had run out, Silas wiped the sweat from his brow, stretched, and lit yet another pillar of high-grade incense. This time, the incense in Silas's hand actually began to glow with a colorful aura, accompanied by a clear surge of spiritual power. But just as everyone thought the ritual was finally reaching a successful conclusion, something happened without any warning whatsoever. A tiny spark of fire suddenly erupted within that colorful aura. A second later, like a wildfire, the entire glow was consumed. It was as if a ball of cotton had been ignited in an instant. Silas's eyes widened in shock as the flames suddenly condensed, forming a literal fireball that slammed violently into his chest. Silas coughed up blood immediately, his body thrown backward, like a kite with a broken string, before he collapsed into unconsciousness. Outside the hall, the onlookers fell into a deathly silence. A moment later, the crowd erupted like a dormant volcano. The ritual had failed, and the spiritual energy had backfired completely. Good heavens, people whispered, this was impossible. Now the Sterling patriarch was truly finished. The staff rushed to help Jacob Sterling into a chair. His son knelt beside him, crying out that he was useless for failing his father. The Sterling family members looked on with pale, grief-stricken faces, their spirits broken by the sight of the disaster. Even the onlookers outside were moved by the tragedy. Watching this, Marcus knew his opportunity had finally arrived. And here we see the opportunity Marcus was waiting for. Aside from the famous god of longevity, several other deities possess the power to extend a mortal's life. First, there is Magu, a female deity of longevity and a maidservant to the Queen Mother of the West, who attained sainthood through immense merit. But compared to the god of longevity, she is, to be honest, a rather obscure choice. Then there is the Star Lord of flaming longevity. As one of the 6 stars of the Southern Dipper, he governs the path of life and death, holding the power to protect and prolong one's flame of life. In folklore, he is often called the Lord of Flaming Longevity. Third, we have the Great Emperor of Long Life, also known as the Old Man of the South Pole. He is the senior disciple of the primeval Lord of Heaven and one of the 6 sovereigns, holding a rank equal to the Jade Emperor himself. Without a moment's hesitation, Marcus hurried to the Divine Registry to search for the names of Magu and the Lord of Flaming Longevity. As for the Great Emperor of Long Life, he didn't even bother looking. A city-level temple like this would never house a deity of such high rank. However, after a meticulous search through the main hall and the side wings, he found nothing. Even in the backyard, where names were crowded together, he checked every single entry one by one, but the result remained the same. There was no sign of Magu or the Lord of Flaming Longevity. Marcus scratched his head in frustration. The chance of a lifetime was right in front of him, yet he was being thwarted by this unexpected lack of options. His mood was incredibly gloomy as his gaze wandered aimlessly across the Divine Registry, searching for any alternative whatsoever. It was at that exact moment that 2 lines of text suddenly caught his eye. At the top were 4 striking characters, the underworld. Below them, in smaller script, was the Hall of Yama. Seeing these 2 lines, Marcus felt a sudden jolt of recognition. His brow furrowed as several terms instinctively flashed through his mind. King Yama, the Book of Life and Death, and the Great Sage. He thought of the monkeys of Flower Fruit Mountain and how their names were struck from the records. To be honest, it was a bold connection to make. Each word acted like a trigger, naturally leading to the next realization. Of course, how could he have possibly forgotten him? In ancient legends, the ultimate deity governing life and death is King Yama, also known as the Lord of the Underworld. As one of the 10 kings of hell, he holds the Book of Life and Death, rewarding good, punishing evil, and maintaining the order of the realms. If we are talking about the power to grant life, no deity is more formidable than King Yama. Even the god of longevity would have to defer to him. Compared to the others, deities like Magu or the Lord of Flaming Longevity only possess a limited set of skills. Their power is more like adding a few drops of water to a dry well. King Yama, however, is a different story entirely. If he truly wishes for someone to live, he has the power to make it happen indefinitely, assuming, of course, he is willing. Furthermore, King Yama is an undisputed heavyweight in the divine hierarchy. In fact, the entire system of the underworld is filled with powerful, albeit overlooked, figures. Even the Great Emperor of the North is no exception to this rule. Hardly anyone offers incense to King Yama these days, let alone the rest of the underworld, save for their supreme leader, Lady Earth. Her incense burns a bit more brightly, as she is one of the ancient primordial creator deities. After all, her status and position are simply incomparable to the other gods of the Dark Realm. In a flash of inspiration, Marcus made his choice. He decided it had to be King Yama. Turning abruptly, he began to hurry back toward the Hall of Longevity once more. Inside the hall, despair was spreading like a rising tide. Arthur sat slumped in his chair, his face looking haggard and worn. It was as if all his strength had been drained away. His wife, Sarah, wept into her hands while their 2 children stood by with worried faces, completely helpless. "Let's go," Arthur said with a weak wave of his hand, his face as pale as ash. He walked at the front of the group as the pilgrims outside automatically cleared a path. Arthur looked toward the distance, where the setting sun cast a blood-red glow, deepening the sense of desolation. He gritted his teeth, each step feeling unbearably heavy. He whispered a silent apology to his father, feeling he had failed. "Please, wait a moment." Just then, a clear voice rang out, startling everyone like a sudden clap of thunder in a quiet room. The crowd turned toward the sound and saw the path part. There stood Marcus, watching the family from a distance. Arthur frowned, looking utterly confused. Behind him, the head priest, Julian, was also stunned by the sight. He wondered why this young man hadn't left yet. But before he could shout a reprimand, Marcus spoke again. "Master Arthur, if I had a way to pray for your father's longevity and succeed, would you be willing to try?" The offer to let him try hit the crowd like a massive boulder dropped into a deep, still pond. A wave of shock rippled through the Hall of Longevity, and the air was suddenly thick with whispers. People began to recognize him, asking if he wasn't the lucky fellow who had just received a divine trace. They wondered how a man who worshipped a god of wealth could suddenly claim to know the secrets of longevity. Julian, the head priest, snapped at him, demanding to know what kind of nonsense he was spouting in such a sacred place. He told Marcus to get lost, then turned to Arthur, pleading with him not to listen to such ridiculous lies. He pointed out that Marcus only worshipped an obscure deity Arthur had likely never even heard of. Ignoring the growing commotion around him, Marcus walked straight up to Arthur and looked him in the eye. He reminded the master that the great priest had collapsed, and there was no better expert available to help. He suggested that Arthur let him try, promising that he might just have a surprise in store for them. The temple staff moved in to remove the boy, but Arthur simply gave a casual wave of his hand. An invisible force suddenly froze the guards in their tracks, leaving them rooted to the spot. Arthur scanned Marcus with a gaze as sharp as lightning, giving him exactly 1 minute to explain himself. The man's powerful aura pressed down on Marcus without mercy, a true display of his status as a rank 5 leader. Marcus found it difficult to even breathe, yet he stood his ground, knowing there was more than one way to pray. He explained that while most people only knew of one deity for longevity, there were others with the same power. He mentioned names like Magu or the Lord of Flaming Longevity, who could also grant the gift of life. Arthur acknowledged that these deities did indeed possess such power, but noted a significant problem. There wasn't a single shrine dedicated to them in the entire city. Marcus, however, had already considered this. He told Arthur he had no intention of worshipping them, as the deity he had in mind was far more potent. He admitted the choice was unconventional, but insisted this deity truly possessed the power to grant longevity. When asked who he intended to worship, Marcus calmly replied that he would pray to the King of Hell. The name echoed through the hall 3 times, and suddenly, a chilling silence fell over the thousands gathered there. It was as if a freezing spell had been cast, leaving everyone wide-eyed and wondering if they had heard him correctly. Julien let out a sharp laugh, as if he had just heard the most absurd joke in the world, looking on in complete disbelief. He let out a foolish, giddy laugh, and as if his laughter had broken a spell, the entire room suddenly erupted into fits of mockery. People whispered that praying to the King of Hell for a gift of life was utter madness. To be honest, they weren't entirely wrong. Marcus ignored them, telling Arthur that the decision was his, and that if he failed, there would be no real loss. He pointed out that at most, they would only lose a few minutes of time. Julien, however, was far from finished. He barked that Arthur's time was far too precious to be wasted by someone as insignificant as Marcus. He warned the boy that in this city, no one dared to mock the powerful Sun family, and Marcus was the very first to try. Ignoring the noise, Arthur locked his gaze onto Marcus, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low tone. He agreed that no one in the city trifled with his family, and we see the stakes rising for our young priest. He warned Marcus that if he couldn't provide a convincing reason for this stunt, there would be consequences. Arthur made it clear that some people would be in a great deal of trouble. Marcus, however, remained perfectly calm. He told Arthur the reason was simple, then turned to Julien and asked him to recount the events of the last 2 days. He suggested that hearing the truth from Julien's own mouth would be the most convincing evidence of all. In an instant, every eye in the room shifted to Julien, who suddenly found himself under the crushing weight of Arthur's gaze. The invisible pressure made it difficult for Julien to breathe as he stammered out that Marcus had visited the temple yesterday. He confessed that with just a single stick of incense, Marcus had raised his divine synchronization to 5%. The members of the Sun family and the onlookers who were still in the dark were left utterly speechless by this revelation. Even Arthur's eyes flickered with a trace of disbelief and suspicion, wondering if such a freakish talent could truly exist. It seemed this young man was a genius, but that was nothing compared to the bombshell he was about to drop today. The crowd buzzed with questions, and while many didn't know Marcus, those who were present yesterday confirmed they had seen it with their own eyes. Listening to the rising chatter, Arthur felt his heart skip a beat as his curiosity was pulled to its absolute limit. His gaze was like a sharp blade cutting into Julien's face as he demanded to know what happened next. Julien stammered that today, Marcus had used only a single stick of incense to raise his divine synchronization once again. This time, he had reached a staggering 43%. In that moment, the entire surroundings completely and utterly erupted, and the shock on Arthur's face grew at a visible speed. Beside him, Sophie's eyes flickered violently as she instinctively covered her mouth in total shock. She had clearly fallen into a state of extreme disbelief, and behind her, the rest of the family members were just as stunned. The guests who hadn't known Marcus before looked as if their jaws might hit the floor. One stick for 5% and another for 43%? To be honest, such a rapid ascent was unheard of in the history of their temple. People began to whisper, wondering if this man was even human. Marcus simply looked at the head of the house. He asked calmly if this reason was enough to grant him a try, meeting Arthur's shocked gaze with perfect composure. Arthur suddenly snapped back to his senses, all his previous arrogance vanishing as he solemnly clasped his hands in a respectful bow. He asked for the young man's name with newfound sincerity, realizing he was standing before someone truly extraordinary. Marcus told him there was no need for such formality, introducing himself simply as Marcus. Arthur managed a rare, thin smile. He then turned to Julien and requested that he prepare several sticks of incense for the King of Hell immediately. Julien asked which grade of incense he required, noting that since Marcus was worshipping this deity for the first time, his synchronization was still 0. Marcus suggested that since his synchronization was 0, they should prepare 3 sticks of incense. Success or failure would be decided within those 3. Arthur agreed to the young man's terms and asked Julien to handle the arrangements, leading the group forward together. The large group traveled deep into the path until they reached their destination, where a dilapidated, wind-leaking thatched hut sat in the shadows. Even compared to the desolate backyard they had just left, the sheer decay of this hut was enough to make one's heart sink. Before they even drew close, we see an old plaque hanging over the swaying door of the hut, bearing four words written in blood-red ink. The sign read, Underworld Prefecture, and seeing it, the young heir Jacob gasped as the temperature around them seemed to plummet. A bone-chilling cold invaded from all directions, and the boy cried out in terror, convinced he saw ghostly fires flickering within. Jacob caught a glimpse of two eerie green glows inside the hut, and immediately hid behind his sister, Sophie, trembling with fear. Sophie scolded him for being useless, asking where he could possibly see light, before she stepped forward to push open the door. As the door creaked open into the heavy silence, we look inside to see the true state of this forgotten place. The room contained nothing but an old square table, upon which sat several memorial tablets of various sizes. There wasn't even a basic shrine, let alone a proper statue of a god, as Marcus stepped forward to take a closer look. The largest tablet in the center bore the name King Yama, while a smaller one to the left was dedicated to the underworld judge. To the right, another small tablet represented the black and white guards, and Marcus, keeping his thoughts to himself, gestured for Arthur to proceed. He suggested that if Arthur was satisfied, they should sign the contract now, and the head of the house gave a firm nod. With a wave of his hand, Arthur produced a contract, stating that regarding the payment, he wouldn't haggle with Marcus at all. He promised to match the terms of the previous master's contract, and if Marcus truly succeeded in extending his life, he would personally hand over 30 million credits, a staggering sum that showed just how desperate the old man truly was. Hearing this, Marcus felt a surge of excitement. The head of a great family certainly didn't hold back when it came to rewards. He agreed to Arthur's terms, and the old man was the first to sign his name on the contract, sealing their desperate bargain. Marcus immediately signed his own name next to Arthur's, and suddenly, without any warning, a strange sound echoed in his ears. It was the distinct clinking of falling copper coins, causing his pupils to contract as he looked down at the wealth-attracting ingot around his neck. The passive ability had been triggered, meaning this contract was guaranteed to succeed, a turn of events that even Marcus found hard to believe. It seemed the ingot possessed a conceptual power of its own. "Sorry to keep you waiting, Mr. Arthur," a voice called out as a man finally arrived. Julian, having arrived late, handed over the incense. Arthur swept it with his divine sense and, finding no issues, gave a small nod. "Thank you for your hard work, Julian," Arthur said, before turning back to Marcus. "Young man, the rest is now in your hands." Marcus assured the head of the family that he would give his all, then politely asked everyone to wait outside for a moment. Once Arthur and his group had retreated, Marcus lit a single stick of incense and began to chant the spirit invitation incantation. However, he wasn't reciting the prayer for the god of wealth this time. Instead, he used the specific mantra to summon King Yama himself. As he whispered the Yama Heart Sutra, the incense in his hand suddenly flared up, burning with an unnatural and intense vigor. In a world invisible to ordinary eyes, a surge of spiritual energy soared into the sky, twisting and turning before transforming into a shape. It became a sharp sword that plunged deep into the earth and vanished, reaching the underworld prefecture where a ghostly wind began to blow. Rows of soul-guiding lamps flickered dimly in the gloom, leading to the end of a dark path where a weathered, vermilion gate stood. The massive gates slowly creaked open, revealing a hall filled with chilling winds where the Oxhead and Horseface Guardians stood on either side. The Oxhead's eyes glowed red like lanterns, his horns wrapped in chains, while the Horseface bared his tusks, holding a cold, gleaming staff. High upon the throne sat King Yama, a figure as massive as a mountain, reclining casually with the air of a seasoned general. He held a wine gourd several times larger than his guardians, tilting it back to pour a continuous stream of liquor into his mouth. Just then, a streak of golden light flew into the hall. King Yama's gaze sharpened as he reached out, caught the light, and swallowed it whole. "Ah, the incense of the mortal realm," he mused, savoring the taste. "It truly has been a long time." He remarked that these mortal cultivators were truly insatiable, having the audacity to bring their schemes and requests even to him. He wondered if these mortals truly believed the underworld, one of the three great realms, was some mere playground for petty spirits. The guardians, sensing his irritation, begged for permission to seize the offender for such audacity, but the king raised a hand. This particular mortal had managed to send incense directly before his eyes, which, to be fair, showed a certain level of skill. The king decided he would see for himself, especially since he hadn't visited the mortal realm in quite some time. Besides, the taste of this specific incense was far too good to ignore. And who could blame him, really? With a single thought, King Yama vanished from his throne, leaving the halls of the underworld behind for the mortal temple. Inside the small hut, a sudden, bone-chilling wind began to howl, making everyone except Marcus shiver uncontrollably. The group looked around in confusion, wondering where this freezing draft had come from, when Julian felt the light above him fade. It felt as though a massive shadow had suddenly draped over them. He instinctively looked up, and what he saw defied explanation. Shocked, he called out to his father, and as everyone followed his gaze, they were utterly rooted to the spot by the spectacle. Above the humble hut, dark clouds had gathered into a heavy mass, swirling with a terrifying, crimson fire. Arthur's son, terrified to the point of nearly losing his composure, stammered out a question about what this monstrosity could be. Even Julian stood with his mouth agape, unable to believe his eyes. Such a phenomenon was beyond anything they had ever witnessed. Arthur couldn't hide his growing excitement as he locked his eyes on the hut, where he noticed Marcus was now shrouded in darkness. A thick, black mist was swirling around the young man. Arthur instinctively tried to rush inside to help, but he was stopped. An invisible force sent him flying back several steps before he could steady himself. It was a clear warning to stay away. Marcus called out from within, telling Arthur not to panic and to wait for his signal, his voice sounding remarkably calm. Inside, Marcus stared steadily at the colossal, ghostly figure manifesting above the altar amidst the howling winds. A voice like stone grinding against stone echoed from every direction, asking the boy if he understood the weight of his actions. The entity looked down and remarked that Marcus certainly had courage, daring to summon a lord of the underworld himself. The entity asked if Marcus wasn't afraid that he might simply harvest his soul then and there, but Marcus just bowed deeply. He offered his greetings, calmly noting that since he was still quite young, he wasn't exactly ready to depart for the afterlife just yet. As for being afraid, he asked why he should fear a righteous god of the three realms, a response that actually drew a booming laugh. The king remarked that Marcus was a sly little fellow, though he certainly possessed a level of courage rarely seen in other mortals. Usually, people would tremble and lose their ability to speak the moment he appeared, but Marcus remained perfectly composed. The king then demanded to know the purpose of his summoning, and as he spoke, the ghostly winds around them grew even colder. It sounded as if 10,000 spirits were weeping at once. Yet Marcus simply explained he had a great merit to offer the king. He told the king that he wished to present him with a significant spiritual reward, which, to be fair, was a bold claim to make. The king's voice turned suspicious, clearly not expecting such an unusual answer from a mere mortal boy. He commanded Marcus to speak the truth immediately, his presence filling the small hut with an overwhelming pressure. He warned that even if the boy's natural lifespan hadn't ended, he could still find a reason to settle accounts early. Marcus didn't waste any time and explained how a man named Silas had tried to trick the heavens into extending his father's life. The king was incredulous, asking if Marcus truly expected him to grant a dying mortal an extension on his natural lifespan. It was a request that defied the very laws of nature, and the king's voice echoed with a mixture of disbelief and amusement. He asked if the boy had summoned the wrong god, reminding him that he was the king of the dead, not the god of longevity. Marcus chuckled softly and reminded the king of the old saying that saving a life earns a great spiritual reward. He suggested that if the king would only lift his hand ever so slightly, that massive merit would belong to him alone. The king erupted, telling him to stop talking nonsense, as if the book of life and death were some mere toy to be played with. He roared that the boy couldn't just add years whenever he felt like it, as such a blatant disregard for heavenly law was unthinkable. To ask a lord of the underworld to agree to such an absurd and lawless scheme was, in his eyes, utterly ridiculous. The king asked if Marcus thought he'd held his position for too long, and as he spoke, the ghostly winds around them grew even fiercer. The temperature in the hut plummeted, becoming bone-chillingly cold, as it became clear that the Lord of the Dead was truly offended. Marcus began to wonder if this particular king of the dead was simply a rigid, law-abiding official who followed every rule to the letter. He thought quickly, realizing that his usual luck wasn't working as expected, and the situation seemed far more dire than he had anticipated. With a frown, he considered his next move, trying to figure out how to appeal to the king's hidden desires in this tense moment. As his eyes scanned the dilapidated and humble surroundings of the small shrine, a brilliant idea suddenly struck him. The king demanded to know why the boy had gone silent, asking if he finally realized he had crossed a line. Marcus admitted that his request was indeed a bit much, which seemed to catch the king slightly off guard. The king noted that at least the boy had some self-awareness, but Marcus quickly added that he had something to offer in exchange. He suggested he could give the king exactly what he wanted, prompting the deity to ask how a mortal could possibly know his desires. The king told him to speak up, and Marcus asked what would happen if he arranged for a magnificent palace to be built in the king's honor. He proposed crafting a golden statue for the king to be worshipped by mortals, wondering if that might earn a small favor in return. He framed it as a minor request, a mere lifting of a hand, in exchange for such grand earthly devotion and a golden body. The idea of a golden statue clearly resonated, especially for a deity who currently had only a simple wooden tablet and no proper image. The promise of a luxurious palace and a golden form hit the king with the force of a physical blow, leaving him momentarily stunned. The king looked around the humble hut and asked if this temple belonged to Marcus's family, his voice betraying a hint of hope. When Marcus admitted it wasn't his, the king's tone softened even further as he asked if the boy's family owned any other temple. Marcus confessed they didn't own one at all, which immediately provoked the king's anger at being teased by a mere mortal. The king roared that the boy dared to make a fool of him, but Marcus quickly urged the great king not to lose his patience just yet. He explained that while his own family was humble, the man seeking a longer life was incredibly wealthy and owned many such properties. Marcus explained that the Sterling family's temple was one of the 4 greatest in the region, boasting immense influence and resources. He promised that if the king agreed, he would convince them to joyfully build a grand temple and craft a golden statue. As we watch the ghostly winds settle, it seems the king of the dead was already lost in a pleasant daydream of his own glory. The king finally spoke, saying that since Marcus was so kind-hearted, perhaps this matter of extending a life could be reconsidered. He admitted he could make an exception this once, prompting Marcus to quickly offer his deepest thanks to the deity. Marcus remarked that the ancient texts always praised this king as the most just among the 10 lords of the underworld. He added that seeing the king's compassion today proved those legends true, and he felt truly humbled by the lesson. The king chuckled dryly, telling the boy to stop with the blatant flattery, though he didn't seem to mind it much. He demanded a specific promise in return, stating that if Marcus could fulfill it, his request would surely be granted. The king repeated that everything Marcus desired would come to pass, provided the conditions were met. Marcus asked for the king's instructions, and the deity brought up the Sterling family's willingness to build the golden shrine. The king then asked a crucial question. If the temple were built, could Marcus guarantee a specific level of devotion? Specifically, he wanted to know if he would receive 10,000 sticks of incense every single day. Marcus was stunned, wondering how on earth he could find 10,000 people to offer worship daily. It was an absurd demand. He realized that since the king was a lord of death and not a god of wealth, few ordinary people would pray to him daily. The king pressed him, asking if he would agree to the deal so that neither of them would be disappointed. The deity's tone had become strangely enticing, almost as if he were trying to lure Marcus into a trap. Marcus had assumed the golden statue would be enough to seal the deal, but he had clearly underestimated the king's greed. This sudden counteroffer caught him completely off guard, leaving him scrambling to find a way out of the predicament. He admitted to the king that providing 10,000 sticks of incense daily was a difficult task, even for a family as wealthy as the Sterlings. Marcus noted that while the king was known for his justice and hatred of evil, most common folk were far too ignorant and fearful of the underworld. He explained that convincing ordinary people to visit a temple dedicated to death every single day would be an incredibly difficult task. As he spoke, a sudden realization hit him. He began to suspect the king didn't want all that incense just for his own personal enjoyment. It seemed far more likely that the king was planning something much bigger, perhaps trying to break into the mortal market for divine offerings. He was likely attempting to establish a foothold for all the underworld deities, expanding their influence and territory into the world of the living. If this plan actually succeeded, it would be an epic undertaking that would shock all 3 realms of existence. Once his 3,000-year term ended, the king wouldn't just be a local lord. He would have the influence to rival the highest emperors of the afterlife. With that kind of power, the king could claim any throne he desired. So he asked Marcus to share his actual thoughts on the matter. The king waited to hear his proposal, and Marcus tentatively suggested a much smaller number of daily offerings to start with. The king was outraged by the boy's audacity, pointing out that while he had asked for 10,000 sticks of incense, Marcus had countered with almost nothing. He scoffed, asking what use a golden statue would be if the offerings were that low, fearing the other lords of death would mock him relentlessly. In a fit of pique, the king demanded Marcus's full name, claiming he wanted to find the boy's ancestors in the underworld and have a word with them. Marcus panicked slightly, wondering why the king had to bring his ancestors into this, but he quickly tried to pivot back to a formal request. He admitted that while he couldn't bring thousands of pilgrims to a temple immediately, he had another way for the king to earn merit and devotion. He proposed an alternative method for the king to enjoy the fruits of worship and build his reputation among the living through more modern means. Marcus offered to bring the king's spirit into his own home for daily worship, promising to use his influence to help more people understand the deity's true nature. He believed that once people truly understood the underworld, they would offer their devotion willingly, and the news would spread from person to person. He argued that reaching 10,000 sticks of incense would be inevitable once the word spread. It was the best solution he could offer for now. A long silence fell over the great hall, and we see the ghostly winds and the sounds of wailing spirits finally fade into a heavy stillness. After a long moment, the king's voice echoed softly through the dark, asking if the boy truly intended to follow through with such a bold plan. The king mused over the idea of being invited into a mortal home for worship, finding the proposal truly bold and unexpected. He asked Marcus if he wasn't afraid that bringing a lord of the underworld home would invite nothing but misfortune and gloom. Marcus quickly reassured him, arguing that since the king wasn't a god of bad luck, there was no reason to fear any ill omens. He claimed his admiration for the king's high status was as endless as a flowing river, and if the king didn't mind his humble status, he was even willing to honor the king as his own adoptive father, feeling emboldened by his previous dealings with other spirits. Since he had already become sworn brothers with a powerful deity, he figured that becoming the king's adoptive son wasn't such a stretch. He realized that whether the king agreed was up to him, and Marcus had nothing to lose by making such a daring request. In business, a little courage goes a long way, though the king clearly hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn. The Lord of Death sat in stunned silence, realizing this mortal boy was actually trying to talk his way into the royal family. The king chuckled, calling Marcus a slippery little fox who was far too clever with his words for his own good. He noted that Marcus wasn't just eyeing the Book of Life and Death anymore, but was now trying to claim a personal connection to the king himself. Marcus insisted that every word was spoken from the bottom of his heart, though the king responded with a skeptical snort. The king decided to set the matter of adoption aside for now, telling Marcus that if he truly wanted such a title, he would have to produce real results and prove his worth rather than just relying on his silver tongue. Seeing the boy's apparent devotion, the king relented and told him to quickly provide the name of the person he wished to save. He promised to check the records first before making any final decisions, which, to Marcus, sounded like a tentative yes. And so, it seemed the deal was struck and the impossible request had actually been granted. With the business concluded, the king signaled for his spectral guards to withdraw from the hall. The ghostly officials bowed deeply as the oppressive atmosphere of the underworld began to lift. As we leave this dark realm, please remember to like, subscribe, and share to support our storytelling journey.